federal court has ruled a key component of the robo-debt system unlawful in another setback for the government's debt recovery scheme. The court found the income averaging process used to calculate the plaintiff's debt was invalid. Joining me now, Joel Townsend, the Program Manager of Economic and Social Rights at Victorian Legal Aid. Thank you very much for joining us. So first of all, can you just explain the particulars of Deana Amato's case for us in its simplest form?
Sure. Deana Amato was a student. She worked intermittently and holidays and the like. She claimed Austudy. She finished her studies. She started work. She ceased receiving Centrelink entitlements. Some years later, Centrelink took the ATO data for her annual income for that year she'd been working. They averaged it out as though she'd earned it evenly, and they assumed that that was what she'd earned, and they raised the debt on the basis of those imputed earnings. That was wrong. She didn't know about it until she found out that her tax return had been taken.
So what are your thoughts on this federal government ruling, basically that a $2,500 debt raised against Deana Amato was unlawful?
Well, we're really pleased that the government has agreed to these orders, which effectively demonstrate that this averaging process can't lawfully underpin a debt being raised against a Centrelink recipient. It's an argument that advocates have been making for some years. It's disappointing that it's taken this long and so many hundreds of thousands of people have been affected, but we're pleased that this is where we've landed.
Well, ultimately, what does this ruling mean?
Well, what it means is what's reflected in the announcement from the government last week, that the government can't continue to use averaging as the basis for raising debts without other information which might really serve to demonstrate that a debt exists. And so that means we say they need to look at all of these debts which have been raised under this process. They need to refund money that has been paid pursuant to debts raised, and they need to let people know who have had a debt raised but not yet repaid the money that they don't need to pay.
So the scheme had targeted about 60,000 Australians. How many of those, I guess it's hard to come up with an exact figure here, but how many of those could potentially have a case?
Well, as I understand it, there are many hundreds of thousands of debts raised under the robo-debt scheme. Now, we say that if there is a debt raised based solely on averaging of ATO data, it cannot pass muster under the social security legislation. So our view is, root and branch, these debts need to be looked at, money needs to be refunded, and government needs to look at a scheme under which it properly raises debts against people who have been overpaid, but doesn't punish people who don't owe a debt. Many Australians receive social security benefits over their lifetime. I mean, it is a system that is fair as well as being lawful.
Do you think this could open up the floodgates, this ruling?
Well, it's not so much a matter of opening up the floodgates. I think the concession by the government in this litigation, like the announcement last week, demonstrates that there was no proper lawful basis for running the robo-debt scheme as they ran it. And so they do need to look at the whole body of debts raised under this robo-debt scheme in its various guises. And so in terms of whether you characterise that as the floodgates, I think the point is there is a heavy responsibility on government to do something to correct for this error.
Well, but how much could it cost the government? If you've got one, then you would have to suggest that there will be many more coming, people sort of challenging their debts that they've had to pay back. How much could this cost the government? Is there a ballpark?
It's impossible to know, and one of the problems with the system is that there has been a lack of transparency about it, as well as there being concerns about lawfulness. There has been a lack of transparency over a number of years as to exactly what debts have been raised and the circumstances under which they've been raised. This is why we say it's incumbent on government to look at this and to consider the question of what ought to be done with those debts which have already been paid. I might say that, of course, where money has been collected by government pursuant to unlawful debts, that's money that the government was not entitled to, and unless and until it can calculate and impose on somebody a debt that is properly and lawfully calculated, it's not money that should properly be in the government's coffers.
All right, appreciate your time this morning. Thank you very much for joining us.